All right, welcome. Today's lecture, Evolutionary Theory, Intro and Applications, will be our third big perspective on locating human psychology in a wider framework. So our story so far, we've had a historical perspective. We looked at modernity, so the major shift in self-concepts and worldviews that occurred in the 1500s and 1600s. And that's still going on. We looked at the Protestant Reformation, the Industrial Revolution, how that changed both some of the structures we live within and how we think about ourselves. We looked at the moral sources, utilitarian and expressive individualism in particular as coming out of modernity. We critiqued instrumental and reductive reasoning and kind of contrasted those with ecological reasoning. And we saw Wachtel critique some of the limitations of what modernity does for community, and Wes Jackson critiques some of the way in which science gets twisted by our desires and how we can get led astray. Today we're talking about the ecological, before we talked about the ecological perspective, which of course grounds itself in evolutionary theory, but I introduced that as a way of thinking about complex systems, so that you have this kind of processual view where you understand things in terms of processes as opposed to stuff, understanding things as dynamically networked, that they're constituted in time by their relationships. And we also talked about recursive nesting, where you have systems within systems. Those are all hallmarks of that ecological perspective. Okay, so the outline for today, we're first going to talk about why evolutionary theory is important for ecological psychology. Then we'll get into evolutionary basics, some evidence for evolution, and some applications. So why do we want to talk about evolutionary theory and ecopsych? Well, one reason is many people would argue that evolutionary theory is one of the broadest and best frameworks we have to understand mind and behavior. There was a famous philosopher of science, Dennett, that talked about, in one of his books, talked about Darwin as being, Darwin's idea of natural selection and evolution as being the best idea ever for explaining things. And I am inclined to agree with that. From a philosophical perspective, the evolutionary perspective lets us stand outside of ourselves and see life as a whole, as part of the same thing that has different facets and features. So more specifically, it locates the mind as a historical event. So unlike Descartes, that took the mind as some kind of fundamental part of the universe, evolutionary theory understands mind as something that came about at a certain point in time. It's a tool, and it's shaped by our ancestral desires, so it's better for doing certain things as opposed to other things. It lets us think about humans as perhaps an aberration. We're a certain kind of primate that learned to think in a certain kind of way and live in a certain kind of way, and it's had huge consequences for the earth. And it also lets us think about our moral instinct as fallible, in part because it's somewhat accidental in its scope and focus. It's shaped by our evolutionary history, the sorts of things that let our ancestors propagate themselves. But today it might be limited. So, for example, it might not allow us to fully grasp the moral significance of a certain species, say, going into extinction. The evolutionary perspective, by its very nature, also rejects atomism. At its core is understanding life as a set of processes and relationships over time, and subtle changes that over time become big changes. And it rejects the blank slate that we get from the empiricists or people like John Locke, who would understand the mind as this neutral thing that could be shaped by anything we desired. So it rejects the view of somebody like Skinner and behaviorism, which understands everything is determined by reward and reinforcement. So the picture I have here to the right is an understanding where, if this is human development, it's going to most likely go into certain channels. So in other words, there's a topography that's going to push us in certain directions. So for example, it's not impossible that, we'll get to this later, that you could have a woman be very aggressive in terms of how she deals with other people. But for reasons we'll talk about later, it's much more likely that you'll get a man to be like that. And it's much more likely that you'll get women that are very tentative about taking certain kinds of risks, whereas you'll get men that are more inclined to take those risks. So in other words, we're not dealing with a flat field. It's already got some channels. And if we understand what those channels are, it makes it easier to understand some of our tendencies. So why is evolutionary theory important for sustainability? A few reasons. One, it gives us a deeper sense of some of the drivers of consumption. So we'll talk about how dominance and resource seeking can lead to consumption, and also how some positional insecurities can lead to consumption. So in other words, we might consume in a way to make up for what we perceive are certain deficiencies that we have. There's also a fear of difference, in-group versus out-group, that affects the way we structure and approach problems. And that's having a huge impact right now on our ability to respond to challenges like climate change or the coronavirus, because it's been politicized, and some folks are inclined to see everything from this lens of in-group versus out-group, us versus them, and that really limits your ability to form coalitions that are inclusive. Also, it can direct us to some strategies for intervention that are more likely to be successful if we kind of know what the root structures are. So just two examples here that come to mind. One is a lot of consumption, I would argue, is status-driven. Status is a deep concern that we tend not to talk about, but that shows up again and again. And then also our coalitional mind, that we are a species that had a lot of intraspecies conflict. In other words, we went to war with each other in our evolutionary history, and it's really shaped the way we approach problems. Okay, so some evolutionary basics now. So the simplest way I can break down evolution for you is to think about it in terms of three processes. One is that you have variation. So specifically, what we're often interested in is genetic differences that occur between things. Then there's some kind of selective force that leads to some copies of certain genes being passed on more than others. That selection, and we'll get into this, but that selection can be natural in terms of, like our finches here, which ones are better able to find food and get at that food, or it can be what we call sexual selection. And that's when whether or not we get to mate depends on whether or not we can earn another person's trust and attraction. So those folks that weren't able to find anybody that wanted to mate with them tended to have less offspring. So that's another kind of selection. And then the third piece that you need is inheritance. You have to have some kind of mechanism, and it's usually think of it as genetic, that takes those traits that are selected, that are retained after your selection force is put into play, and get those passed down. So we'll break these out, but just I want to quick highlight a few implications of this way of looking at the world. One, it's to suggest that we all have a common ancestry. So in a sense, every bird, every reptile, every crazy dog is our cousin. And there's also an implication, if you have this mechanism playing out like this, that over time you'll see a gradual growth in diversity and complexity. Not always, but general things are going to get driven towards more complexity. So one quick example, if you look at a rainforest, that rich diversity of life and all the different crazy kinds of insects and birds and other kinds of animals, that is brought about by these evolutionary processes of small changes getting amplified over time. And then the third one, from a moral or a cosmological perspective, given that we have that common ancestry, we're all part of the same web of life, and there's, in some sense, a deep unity to life as opposed to just a bunch of differences. Okay, so I found this great graphic, and I tried to link here to the source that I found it at, but it's suggesting a way of thinking about these different finches. So if you haven't recognized them, these are some of the finches that Darwin found on the Galapagos Islands when he was traipsing around the world on the Beagle, a small ship. And he was a naturalist. So at that time, we kind of had different roles, and we didn't have as many university professors as we do now. But he was just a rich gentleman that had some income from estates or whatnot, and he had spare time, and so he spent it doing science. And he realized that on the Galapagos Island that there was many different kinds of finches, and he had a great eye for detail, and he noticed that their beaks were slightly different. So the person that made this graphic is suggesting that these different beaks are analogous to different kinds of pliers. So the vice grips, which is the powerful locking beak, or this jaw is suggested to be a channel plier where you can adjust it to different settings. Here's just a straightforward pliers, which has its own properties, and then a needle nose plier. So if you ever do anything around the house or try to break things, you'll realize that these tools work well for different purposes. There's some times where you need a needle nose plier to get at what you want to get at, and there's some times where you need this vice grip, etc. But in essence, these different beaks were good at getting at different kinds of food. And so these animals were able to get into different kinds of niches, and they defined different kinds of niches, in some ways created those niches by the kind of beaks that they had. So another way of looking at this is to suggest that over time there was this speciation that occurred where there was this adaptation going on to different kinds of foods. Now, one thing that's important to think about, when I say the word adaptation, it's not as if a given bird adapts. A bird is born with a kind of beak that's driven by a certain genetic heritage, and that beak may or may not work for the food that's available. So the way adaptation works is there's different rates of survival. A bird that happens to be lucky and born with a beak that's going to work for a certain kind of environment that he or she finds themselves in is more likely to pass on the genes and therefore the characteristic of that beak to its descendants. So that adaptation is something that a population does as opposed to an individual creature. Back to the diagram, you can see here that there's different kinds of food sources that are laid out, and then there's different kinds of bills that'll work for those different kinds of food sources, and then those finches are representing different birds have those different kinds of beaks. So one thing to keep in mind is you can start off with one kind of general design and drop that animal into two different locales with two different kinds of food sources, and over time you might see a divergence. But many times you'll see this in nature where there's a continuum of features, and it's not just distinct types, because little variations can open up new resources over time. Okay, so another way of thinking about the same thing, you got some bird, some finch that migrates from the mainland, goes off to the Galapagos Islands. And you got two kinds of stories here. One, they might continue to eat seeds, and then there's lots of seed eating, so many don't survive. So that population of seed-eating finches remains stable. Whereas on the other side, if they had slightly different beaks, maybe then they could go after insects, and there's a whole different food source that they could compete for. So there's far less competition for food among these insect-eating finches, and you might see that population grow. But the short story is they're specializing around different food sources. So a quick similar process. If you think about birds eat a lot of insects. But insects aren't out all the time. Some insects just come out at night. Well, bats occupy a similar kind of niche that birds do. In other words, they fly around and eat insects, but they exploit a different part of that environment, of that habitat. In other words, they're out there at night eating those insects. And so you can see how different animals compete and jostle for different food sources, and they might move in different directions to exploit different types of food sources, and that leads to speciation. Okay, so how does selection then shape the variability that we see? Well, there's different kinds of selection, and this is another nice diagram I found, and the source is down here. But you have here an example of, let's say that for some salamanders, if they have a long wiggly tail that looks like a snake, that'll scare predators. It'll make it more likely that they survive. And so over time, if there's really no benefit to a short tail and only a benefit to a long tail, you'll get directional selection, where the whole distribution moves from shorter to longer. So they're moving away from one extreme to another. you also get stabilizing selection where there's disadvantages and advantages on either tail. So let's imagine a situation where for a cat, if the tail's too short, it doesn't have the right balance, and if it's too long, it'll drag on the ground. And so what you have instead, is something in the middle, and the distribution then stabilizes around some median value. That means there's selective pressures on both sides that keep it more in the middle. And then finally over here on the right, we have disruptive selection, where it doesn't work to be in the middle. So the analogy here, or the example, is with, say, a chipmunk and a squirrel. If you're a ground living mammal, you don't want the tail getting in the way because it'll make it easier for predators to catch you. But maybe if you're living in the trees like our squirrel friends, they need that tail for balance. And so what you get, and this should look familiar from statistics, but you'll get a bimodal distribution where you have one population that has short tails, ground squirrels, and another population that has long tails, tree-dwelling squirrels. So depending on what the selection forces are, it can drive the distribution of traits in different kinds of directions. All right, so just to pause for a second and think about psychology traits, like the big five, extroversion, agreeableness, etc. These tend to be distributed normally. In other words, and you'll see some deviations from that, but in short, people kind of have most people tend to have middling values on these. So in other words, the world isn't comprised of introverts versus extroverts. Most of us are somewhere in the middle on that characteristic, and only a few people are at the extremes of it. And that's probably because we have some stabilizing selection going on, where if you're really introverted, there's cost to that. And if you're too extroverted, there's cost for that. So there's forces that are kind of pushing you to some value in the middle. So I'm just trying to connect the idea of a normal distribution to this idea of a stabilizing selection. Okay, so selection pressures can change over time. So over here on this side, we have the pre-industrial revolution, where you have a clear benefit for the moth that looks grayer because it will blend into the kind of trees. But over time, as time increases, what happens? You have a change in that soot develops on the trees such that after a while, there's selective pressure that's going to favor the dark moth. And so you can see over time the prevalence of the dark moth, that sounds like Dark Maul from Star Trek. Sorry, I didn't mean to suggest that. That goes up, and then the prevalence of the white goes down. So one thing we can gather from this is there's no such thing as survival of the fittest. It's survival of the fitted, F-I-T-T-E-D. In other words, early on, this moth was a better fit, and it was more prevalent. And then later on, that moth was more prevalent and was a better fit. Okay, so some finer points from evolutionary theory. Okay, so we just talked about that myth, the survival of the fittest. So there is competition and there's jostling among the species. But for one thing, it's not as if a given snake is thinking, boy, I hope I can outcompete those other snakes. The competition is something that we see more from the abstract level or the macro level. So it's survival of the fitted, not the fittest, because it all depends on what the environment is, and the environment changes. And then one of the things we try to do with the evolutionary perspective is get beyond the standard social science model. So the standard social science model is something that evolutionary psychologists smack their head about and wish wasn't true. So that's the view of the world where everything is a blank slate, no behavior is pre-wired, and for example, you might imagine that, well, maybe there's societies where women are more likely to be powerful and aggressive, or maybe there's societies where men love to talk about their feelings. Well, most evolutionists would say it's very unlikely to find that because culture's not random. Culture and individual differences between men and women arise from real forces, and that if we don't understand what those forces are, we're going to be terribly naive and we're not going to have good guidance on how to build good theory. It also points us beyond this fantasy of pure rationality that we get from economics. So economics would have us believe, at least in its simpler forms, that we're all just pursuing our individual self-interest, and that human behavior in society is just an aggregation of those self-interests. But we know people do things that are not in their self-interest. For example, people donate blood and they don't get paid for it. They're getting something, but it's not purely self-interest. Things are more complicated than that. We have loyalties and ways of looking at the world that can't be boiled down to just a narrow-minded self-interest. So one way to think about evolution is the evolved mind is like a trellis, or it's like a pergola, but it's basically a structure on which a vine can grow. Now the vine can go up and the vine can go this way or the vine can go that way, but at some point it all has to come back to the trellis. And if something goes too far out and it can't be supported by the trellis, it won't work. So, for example, you can see this in different breeds of different dogs. So, the kind of dog I have, a Terrier Dachshund mix, if you try to convince that dog that it doesn't need to bark at things, you're going to have a really hard time. If you try to convince a Labrador Retriever that it's really an aggressive, mean dog, you're going to have a hard time. Those dogs were bred to select for and to weave in certain kinds of characteristics. So retrievers, by their very nature, like to have things in their mouth. They're very gentle because they were meant to retrieve fowl that had been shot. They don't want it being torn up. Whereas if you give my dog a sock, it will act like it's some kind of small mammal that it's caught underground and just shake the hell out of that thing trying to kill it. And if you try to reason with it and say, Mabel, the sock's already dead. In fact, it never was alive. She'll just keep shaking because that is how her breeding has worked. So in other words, there's certain limits, there's certain standards about the way different kinds of evolved species operate. Okay, then there's also some misuses of evolutionary psych. One thing is to look at the way things are in the real world. Like I would argue for you that men tend to be more aggressive. But that by no means suggests that I am arguing that therefore we should tolerate men being more aggressive and we should have lighter penalties for when men act badly. On the contrary, I think if we know what some of the inborn tendencies are that people have, we can devise better systems for optimizing outcomes. But the short story is just because there's tendencies that are given to us by evolution, no way means that we have to accept those as the ones that we want to live with. Another way of saying that is I think that knowledge of some of these, you could say hardwired or tendencies that we have, makes us more response able. In other words, we're better able to adjust things and get the world we want as opposed to just have a fantasy that all people are infinitely malleable and not recognize that they come with some pre-wired behaviors. Okay. All right, and then one side note, why is evolution threatening to some of us? Well, I have over here on the left the tree of life, and I have indicated where we are on that, and I'm hoping that suggests to you one possible answer, in that it looks like animals are just some kind of random species on some kind of random branch of the universe, and that there's nothing particularly special about them. And certainly if humans are some branch of animals, then there's really not anything special about us. So it's kind of decentering in similar ways when in the Middle Ages they started realizing that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, that it's the other way around. So some people react to that and come up with phrases like Darwin lied. I would suggest, ironically, that this actually shows evolutionary theory in working, evolutionary thinking in action, in that to think that somebody you disagree with is trying to attack you and is trying to deceive you and trying to outwit you reflects some of the shapings that we've had from our evolutionary histories where we went to war with each other. We went to war with different groups, and we tended to not trust foreigners. So anybody that was not native, was a stranger, was a threat. Well, to think that Darwin, if you read any of his writing or read about his character, he was just this kind of curious nerd. To think that he spent his whole life constructing this fabrication just to deceive people doesn't make a lot of sense. But I will say, I certainly get it. And when I was in school and I first understood about the evolutionary hypothesis, I was horrified because at the time I saw that as incompatible with my Christian faith. Since then, I and many other people have come to different kinds of conclusions about that, where there's not an inherent incompatibility between an evolutionary view of the world and the idea that there's a creator. So I would just suggest to you that you might treat evolutionary theory like a hat, that you try it on, see how it fits, see what it can do for you. But at the end of the day, if you want to take the hat off, no one's going to stop you. But you shouldn't believe a priori that there's some kind of deep threat to other things that you believe just because of this theory. Okay, so those are some evolutionary basics. Now we're going to move on and talk about some of the evidence for evolution. Okay, so this will be fairly fast. I have noticed in my years of teaching that the number of people who are adamantly opposed to evolution has dropped drastically, but I still think it's worth just trotting out some of the evidence. So one of the first things I would say is that why should we believe in evolution? Well, it fits the data. We call it a theory of evolution because it's used to make inferences, and it's set up in a way where it can be refuted by certain findings. So in science, just because we call something a theory doesn't in any way mean it's not known or not a fact. So I would take, for example, most people don't have any problem believing that we live in a solar system, that there are certain planets that go around the sun in a certain kind of way. And you might build out certain kind of models like are reflected here, and we act as if we know that the solar system looks like this. I would say to you that no one who lives on the Earth has actually seen the solar system. The solar system is a theory that we've cooked up that explains how the planets move and behave. But these distances that are reflected in this depiction of the solar system are not accurate. These distances are much larger relative to the actual size of the planets. In some of these planets you couldn't even see, and Jupiter would be ginormous relative to these other ones. So we have to remember that all these models we build of the solar system and make it something that's very touchy-feely, that doesn't feel that foreign, those are just abstractions, and that there's no there when we talk about the solar system other than the theory that predicts certain behaviors of certain things in certain ways. So if evolution seems kind of broad and untouchable, it's really no different than the solar system in terms of what we can actually see and represent. So just like there's evidence for the elliptical path of the planets, the spherical shape of the Earth, the solar system, all these facts, the only thing that really makes them make sense is the theory of the solar system. In the same way, the evidence for evolution is vast and overwhelming, and it's impossible to make sense of all the things that we see in nature without the theory of evolution. Okay. Also, the common ancestry is in our bones. So it's almost like there's a social security, or excuse me, a serial number that's been imprinted on pieces of our bones that trace back to a common ancestor. And if it all comes from a common ancestor, that suggests that evolution is correct. So in the language of Gregory Bateson, what's the pattern here that connects these different bones? Now, if you'll notice, these three sets of bones are all from mammals. That means they all came from the same ancestor. They look very different, but we'll see the similarities when we look a little bit closer. Okay, so these have homologous forms. What that means is there's the same basic relationship among the different bones across the three species. So what happened over time is these different parts evolved to different uses. So if you notice on the purple arrows here, that's pointing to the little cartilage space between the digits. You can find that in any one of these bones. And if you look more carefully, you have something where there's like a shoulder plate kind of thing, and then there's a bone that comes out of that divides in two. So here's one bone, it divides in two, and then the two divide into what in the humans is this bones of the lower hand, same thing here, and then all the digits that are on the end. So because the relationships and the basic structure are the same, that means they all came from the common ancestor. In other words, if somebody was making these from scratch, it'd be really weird that for these different environments and these different functions that they use the same basic structure. It suggests that we all came from the same ancestor. And you can do this with a bunch of other mammals as well. So if you're looking at Mr. Bat here, these are the bat's digits. And here for the mole, these are the digits. And then here for the walrus, there are the digits. They are used for different purposes, flying, digging, or swimming, but you can see that they all came from the same common ancestor. So homologous means that there's, as in homo, they're same. So there's a similar relationship between the bones across the different species that share the common ancestor. Okay, there's also this research on the genetic mutations that we've seen over time. So there's different kinds of DNA, and there's the mitochondrial DNA is unique, and it serves a certain purpose for scientists. Because of the way it is passed down, it doesn't recombine with, say, like you're combining from the mother and the father for the genetic diversity, the genetic pattern of the offspring. It only gets passed down directly. So the only way it changes is through mutations. And those mutations occur on a regular basis, on a predictable basis, such that if you look at how many mutations have occurred in a certain line, you can tell about how long it's been. So it provides for us a clock. It's like a set of breadcrumbs that we can trace back to understand where people came from. So they can look in all the different genetic lines that came out of Africa and where those lines crossed and where they migrated to. And it's very specific. And they've gone to these different parts of the world to get samples of DNA so they can figure out exactly the history of humans moving over the planet. Okay, so just to give you a close-up here, they know that humans came in this arc through the Fertile Crescent out of Africa and came into Europe. And they could label what migration that was. And they can look and see how people got to Australia. And the timing maps up with what we know about the ocean levels at a time. When the ocean levels were down during an ice age, there was a passage, a land bridge that opened up such that migrations could occur to Australia. So again, it's very specific, and they can trace all these migration patterns given this DNA on the Y chromosome. So big picture-wise, we can see that there is these different hominoid waves coming out of Africa. You can see Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, and Homo neanderthalis. The colors indicate where these different populations migrated to. So you can see Homo erectus made it out a certain way. The Homo neanderthalis made it into Europe. And then you can see with humans, we ended up going everywhere. And these are, the numbers are the dates thousands of years ago where people showed up. So as you can see, the New World really is, in other words, the Americas really is a new world in that humans didn't arrive there until pretty recently, only 12,000 years ago. And then Columbus and his homies eventually come over much later than that. But it was late in the evolutionary scheme of things that humans actually made it over to North America and then South America. So the fact that we can trace all those gives us a real clear sense of that there were different types of humanoids, and they moved in different kinds of ways. So it's not as if we have any trouble finding where our ancestors were. Another point related to that is the genetic diversity is higher in certain regions than in other regions. It's higher in Africa, specifically in this lower tip of Africa, because that's when Homo sapiens first arrived on the scene, and they had more time in this local environment to propagate and to move around, and so more diversity got built up. Then when they eventually started moving out and going in different directions, these are occurred much later, so there hasn't been as much time for these genes to mutate and take on new forms. And so the pattern of genetic diversity also points to a specific development of humans at a specific point in time, and the small changes in the species over time gives us evidence that we're correct about the human origins. Okay, so the genetic, this is more just kind of a side note, but it's fascinating. The genetic differences also fit in with what we know about the conquest of Eurasia. So they started finding these similarities between these different mitochondrial DNA, where at some point they're like, why are these connected in this way? And you can see they trace all the way over into Europe. And eventually they started saying, is this freaking Genghis Khan? And turns out it is freaking Genghis Khan. So Genghis Khan was a Mongol leader, and they had this tremendously effective, deadly style of warfare where they rode in from the steppes and terrorized all these different settled populations. And there was much mayhem that came about. So there was these populations were killed off, or at least all the men were killed off, and then there was a bunch of classic raping and pillaging. And so the genes of Genghis Khan and his relatives got seeded, so to speak, in these different areas, and we can still see evidence of that today. Okay, we can also look at the fossil record. So as you could see before, when we had the map of the genetic lines moving around, we have found different fossil records of different kinds of hominoids. So where are we? We are here. We are the Homo sapiens. And we are a relatively recent line, but our advantage is we've lived into the present. So you can see here, this is Homo sapiens. You can see where we branched off from, and some of our distant relatives. But these lines have, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalis, Homo floresiensis. Those have gone extinct. And then there's other hominoids in our past that have gone extinct. So it's not as if there's humans and then apes. There's hominoids that comprise a large number of variations where they're not quite apes, and they're not quite they're not quite non-human apes, and they're not quite modern day humans. They have some in-between features. So what that does is leave us with this idea that there's these intermediary forms. And if you're finding an intermediary form, that's pretty strong evidence that there's evolution, because that's what evolution means, is it's small changes in forms over time, right? So you have some artists here that have reconstructed what faces might have looked like given the bone structures of the fossils that we found. And when you look at this face, there is something where it's kind of human, but it's kind of not. And so the fact that there's this intermediary form between modern humans and our ancestors suggests that we are all part of the same lineage, that we came from the same line. Okay, so how did primate speciation work? You had our earliest ancestors, the earliest primate was some kind of little mouse-like creature that existed during the dinosaurs age. But when the dinosaurs died off, because they all had that run-in with that mean asteroid, the ecological space opened up for all the primates to move into that. And so you have a whole bunch of different primates that emerged. Some of them got big. You had old world monkeys, and apes and humans are down here. More specifically, you had the old world primates, old world monkeys, and then the hominoid line. And we were just looking at the hominoids a few slides back, but that's where we end up here. This is our closest relatives. We got humans, and then chimpanzees and bonobos. It wasn't until I think like the 1950s that they realized that there was actually two species of so-called chimps, and they weren't all the same. There was this other species called bonobos. So we recently, in terms of evolutionary history, split off from a common ancestor that we share with the chimps and bonobos. And all this can be supported with DNA analysis. So in other words, humans and chimps, I think, have something like 99.5% of the same DNA. Okay, so there's close relatives that share our features in the hominoid line with primates. And then there's also intermediary forms that we can find in non-humans. So what lineage do you think this fossil fits into? So it looks like it's got like a body like a fish, but it's still got these hand-like things. Well, it turns out that this is a proto-whale. So I'm not sure I can pronounce this, but Mesectus inus. And so by proto-whale, we mean like it was a creature that probably lived in the brackish water of rivers close to the ocean, and it had its own ecosystem or whatever, but eventually descendants of this moved on, and different lines branched off, and some of them ended up producing the current males. Sometimes people worry about the interaction between these two, this guy and this guy. They're friends. They play this game where he tries to run across the river. It's not like he's trying to eat him, so don't worry about that. Okay, so whales and their relatives. Evolution allows us to see these connections that otherwise would make no sense in terms of the genetics. So back in the day, so to speak, there were these early ungulates. So ungulate, think like modern day cow. And then you had early whales come off from that. And then you had dolphins, actual whales, and then the hippos. And so when you look at the DNA, you can see how these are all connected, and it makes sense given the evolutionary history. Another intermediary form, the Puljila, was a walking seal. So it was a seal that hadn't quite gotten around to evolving in a way where it had flippers. It still had these digits, and it was found in the way north part of Canada, near the pole. And whoops, I thought I had another slide. I guess I don't. But anyway, it's an intermediary form, so it was some kind of land-dwelling mammal that eventually moves into the water, and it continues to change, and the seal evolved from this guy. All right. 8, if you can look across different races and cultures, you can see that we have these common emotions. And so the fact that we have the common emotions suggests that there's a common basic structure that we have. Many things are socially constructed. In other words, culture can influence the types and expressions, the variations on the emotions that we express, but there is these fundamental types that are consistent across different races and cultures. And even more importantly, we see these same emotional expressions with our friends, the chimps. Remember, one of our closest relatives. So I found this, guess what, on the internet, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of the people that contributed to this had some feelings that weren't wholly positive about certain Democrats. But I would say that points to a larger issue, that evolution makes some people uncomfortable because it shows some similarities that we have between us and some things that we would consider would be animals. And there's some research that suggests that when you get people to think about how they're similar to animals, it causes them different kinds of consternation. But to be fair, this is something you can do with any human, even a Republican like George Bush. So the point here, if we have such similarities in terms of our emotional expressions, that's really strong evidence that we are come from the same place. And here's a cute one a student shared with me once. It's a young chimp or gorilla, I'm not sure. But you can see what's happening here is they're checking the heart rate, and you can see pretty quickly figure out what happened. And it's cold, right? So that metal, when it touches, you get this certain expression of like shock and a little bit of pain. Well, two things are going on. One, that's saying that this animal is experiencing an emotion that you're pretty familiar with, but the fact that you even feel for it and might go, oh, that would be cold, that you're tied with that kind of sympathy, that really suggests that this we have some pretty deep common roots there that suggest an evolutionary common ancestor. Okay, and then last point for the evidence of evolution. Dogs represent a proof of concept. So in other words, dogs are thought to largely have people believe that dogs evolved from wolves, but more recently, in the last few hundred years, we get all these different species of dogs. So you can see here what I think is the most beautiful dog, the Dachshund, stands for badger hound. They were bred to have the disposition where they would go underground, find the badger, drag it out, and kill it. So it has a certain kind of disposition. Other dogs are built for different purposes. So the fact that you can get dogs to be bred like this, to have different kinds of dispositions and builds, suggests that evolution is true. Also, there's the deeper history of evolution suggests that dogs were some of the earliest technologies. If you think about how useful a dog would be to you, it could warn you when enemies were approaching. It could be warm on a cold night. It could eat some of your food that would otherwise start stinking. So you can look at dogs and the way they behave and see that they are intertwined in our evolutionary history. They get us. That is part of their intelligence because they have a shared evolutionary history. So this is a dog of mine that has now since then gone on to his great reward. But at the time, he was looking at my then wife, Michelle, packing up, and Schnitzel was saying, "What the heck is going on here? I don't like the signs of this." And so he proceeds to engage in certain kinds of behaviors where it's cute, right? But it's also strategic in that you really don't want to leave somebody that is this cute. Now, I think he got tired at one point, or he started drinking, and this maybe not be so cute. He looks kind of crazy here, but back here he looks pretty cute. So there's something about this, that there's a relationship between us and dogs that suggests that we shared an evolutionary wiring. One way to see this is figure out, when do you think a dog is the cutest? I would suggest to you it's when you have food and it wants to be fed. It will look and attend in a certain way that is extremely cute because its ancestors that did that were more likely to get the food and survive. Okay, so some applications of all this good evolutionary stuff. One point I'd make out for us that care about psychology is that evolution has a huge impact on our social lives, and it has constructed our social lives. So some examples of that. One example is we have a relatively big brain. So nature, so to speak, made a deal with us. It's like, okay, we'd like to have you have a bigger brain, but if you have a bigger brain too early, in other words, when you're still inside the woman's womb, that brain is not going to be able to get out because the head's going to be too big. And you ask some women that have given birth, and they would be like, well, it's already too big. I think we should have changed this sooner. But what happened is evolution worked out this deal, so to speak, where the brain continues to develop after birth. But that makes the offspring really vulnerable for a long period of time because it takes a long time for that big brain to grow to its adult size. So for that to work, you had to get at the same time this evolution of a certain kind of motherly love, this devotion a mother has to her offspring, that could sustain the attention that she would give to the offspring, such that when the brain was developing after birth, the mother didn't get bored with the kid a year or 2 years in. If you look at other animals, the mother gives birth and the mother's not attentive for very long, and pretty soon the animal can take care of itself. We're very different. We're dependent for a long time. The thing that makes that possible is the evolution of motherly love. You can also look at the size of our teeth. There is an evolutionist that argues that because once fire was invented, that changed the functions that we needed teeth for, and so we didn't have to expend energy on such large canine teeth to rip and tear flesh. We could heat it with fire, and that made it so we could see a change in the size of teeth. You can also look at the relationship between hunting and sharing. Hunting has a certain kind of dynamic where if you go out with 5, 6, 7 guys, one person might get lucky on one day and another person might get lucky on another day. So the optimal system would be everybody shares. So there's evidence that because we hunted for meat and we needed meat for our brains to develop, because they're so big and require so many calories, we had to develop a sense of sharing and a sense of reciprocity. So social psychologists might talk about our norms for reciprocity, but evolutionary psychologists could say it's likely because of the demands of the ancestral environment where we had to share meat. And they can point to where that norm of reciprocity came from. Okay, and then on the stranger side, I just read a book on this, the execution hypothesis by Richard Wrangham. The book is called The Goodness Paradox. And his idea is you have to understand there's two kinds of aggression. There's the reactive aggression, which happens when somebody insults you and you get angry and you want to do something about it, or something breaks and you have that feeling of rage. That's in the moment, immediate kind of reactive aggression. We are different from chimps in that we have a lot less reactive aggression. There's scientists that have talked about, you've put a bunch of chimps on an airplane like we do with people, there ain't no way all those chimps are leaving with all their digits and arms and fingers attached. There would be mayhem if you put them that close. We tend to get along really well with each other in small companies, especially if we're of the same family. That's reactive aggression. Proactive aggression is the kind that's more cold and calculating, where you think about something and you're like, it'd be to my advantage to go kill that person. And I'm going to have this plan. I'm going to have this premeditation and do that. So Wrangham's hypothesis is that once language evolved, people could figure out who the bullies were and who the people were that continually caused problems. And since there was no prisons, there was no judicial system, the only thing you could really do effectively was to kill them. And over time, what happened is people developed the language and the weapons where they could execute bullies. And what they did is create a selective pressure that over time lowered our amount of reactive aggression so that we can live in tight quarters and get along with each other and ride airplanes together, all that kind of stuff. The problem, though, is that didn't diminish our capability of planned aggression, in other words, that proactive aggression. So if you look at folks like Hitler or lynchings or police violence or gangs, we're still very capable of all kinds of aggression. And it's almost more dangerous because we can do it coldly and calculate it out in advance. And there's a dysfunction in that we tend to think differently about people that are in our family or our kin group versus those that are outside us. So once you add the us-then dynamic to things, the potential for human violence is pretty deadly. But in conclusion, Wrangham has this idea that we engaged in this process of self-domestication, where we selected for something in a way that changed us, and there's a bunch else that goes into his idea, but that's the quick snapshot of it. Okay. So more specifically relevant to consumption and thinking about sustainability, evolutionists have engaged this issue. Why do we do what this has been called in the past conspicuous consumption? So there's certain kinds of consumptions, especially like luxury goods, where we want others to see that we're using them. It's not something that we do in private. It's something that we're pretty conspicuous about. So this is from an economist named Veblen, who wrote, I think it's over 100 years ago now, but he was trying to come up with an explanation of this. These researchers came up with this study where they manipulated one small thing to look at the effect that luxury has on luxury symbols have on the way people get treated. And their theory is the self-handicapping principle. You'll see this in nature, like with peacocks here. The peacock, the male, the extent to which these eyes, so to speak, are of high quality will make him more attractive to the females. And the plumage isn't necessarily an advantage when the peacock is trying to run away from predators. In fact, it's kind of a handicap. But the theory goes, it's only comes about because he has such good genetics that he can afford to flaunt it. So he is more likely to get mates because he has the high quality plumage. So similarly, they're arguing that men and women and others that wear luxury symbols like a Tommy Hilfiger shirt are saying, you know what, I got enough money that I can spend it on things like expensive shirts. And that sends a signal that I have extra resources and I might be generous with those resources. So those people tend to get better treatment. And they could show in this study that people that were wearing these logos, the Tommy Hilfigers versus something else, and it was more complicated than that. They had different control groups and whatnot. But in essence, if you're wearing a high status shirt, people were more likely to comply with survey requests. They were more likely to think that the wearers of those shirts should be paid more. And they were more likely, they got more donations for charity when they went door to door asking for donations. So it's an interesting phenomenon in that it just explains why people are attracted to luxury goods. But it also gives us some sense that people might be competing with each other in terms of who can show off the luxury goods, and that might be driving some of the consumption that we see. So in other words, people aren't just necessarily trying to meet their basic needs. They're motivated to try to compete to look like they have wealth and status. Okay, then just as a joke, would this be overkill? Peacock with the Tommy Hilfiger shirts and chains? Who knows? Okay, there's also evidence that people engage in what's called compensatory consumption. And so what they found is that they did 2 studies, and the first one demonstrated that people judge larger sized products, like if you have a range of different products, the larger ones suggested that they were higher status. And they also found that when people were made to feel powerless, they were more inclined to pick the supersized options. So this is several years ago, but it used to be at McDonald's that you could supersize your order of fries or supersize your drink size. And what they're suggesting is it's people are doing that not necessarily because they want more French fries, but they want to feel that little perk of status that they get from ordering the bigger version. So I think you could apply that to why some folks might like to go to someplace like Golden Corral, the idea of the buffet. You can eat as much as you want, and the fact that it's a big amount of food that you can get might convey a certain amount of status and make you feel more powerful. But I think this might have other implications when you look at the size of certain SUVs, for example, or the size of certain people's homes, that there could be this way in which they feel like they're needing to compensate for something or express that if they feel a certain way, they might be motivated to buy something that makes them feel better. So you could imagine how that could have huge consequences for the amount of consumption that we do. Okay, and we'll spend more time on this in following lectures, but I want to introduce it here. Parental investment theory is huge in terms of its explanatory potential. What Trivers did in 72 is look at males and females and argued and showed that they face these different reproductive challenges and opportunities just based on the mechanics of how they reproduce. So females are in a situation where even if you're really busy as a female and pregnant most of your life, you're going to top out at maybe 20 kids. And most women, I say that too, they're already kind of horrified. But there are certain limits on the number of kids you can have just given a 9-month pregnancy, some time to recuperate, get pregnant again, etc. So there's a huge investment in each offspring. Each kid has really got to count. And also because of the demands of the big brain and feeding the kid who's dependent on you initially, you require a lot of assistance. So you become choosier in who you're going to mate with, and you're a little more risk averse because you know if something happens to you, your kids likely would not survive, and you might have some preferences for more well-resourced mates. In other words, since you are going to be hard-pressed to go hunting and foraging when you have a young child, you're going to need to have somebody who can do some of that for you. So it's, in the ancestral environment, remember, very different from today when you have different kinds of social systems and appliances and things that can help single mothers. Back in the day, if you weren't getting that help from your own mother or from a mate, it would be difficult. Males, on the other hand, face a different set of challenges. So they can potentially have many, many, many offspring because the investment is negotiable. Now, there are many men out there that make investments such that they are intimately involved in the raising of their children. But it's at least possible for men to not engage in that because their investment is not obligatory, to use Trivers' words. So men potentially are less choosy or more willing to have sex at the drop of a hat, or at least with less time spent getting to know the other person relative to the woman. They also tend to be more risk-prone and aggressive. And there's some mechanics we'll talk about here, but if you think about it, if when you get angry, you might defeat some competitor and then get resources that allow you to attract a mate, there may be advantages to doing that. Because even if you get killed in doing that, someone else could raise your kids for you, namely the woman. Additionally, if you think about it from a genetic perspective, going back to Genghis Khan, if you have 100 men and 99 of them die young because they're aggressive and leave no offspring, if the 100th one is Genghis Khan and is able to conquer huge areas of land and impregnate thousands of women, well, you're still, that gene is for aggressiveness is still going to pay out, so to speak. Men, however, also need to be more concerned about youth and beauty. So you can describe men as shallow, and there's something to that, but most of the time, the way scientists think about it is the reason men are specifically more inclined to be concerned about youth and beauty in terms of who they're attracted to, because those things are markers for fertility. So the males that had a lot of sex, but with females that were not young enough to have children, didn't pass those genes on that guided that behavior. Whereas those men that were attracted to young, fertile women were more likely to have a lot of children and pass on those genes. Okay, so some of the things we see is that women tend to prefer more resourced men. So this is one simple study they did where they pictured a guy either in an apartment that wasn't so fancy or a more fancy apartment. And they also did this so there was women judging him, and then on the other side, men judging women who were either in a fancy apartment or not. And what they found is moving the guy from not so fancy to a fancy apartment made him more attractive for women, but men didn't care. And again, this goes to the basic differences in terms of the parental investment. The women are much more inclined to be attracted to somebody that has resources, where men are going to be more driven by things like, is the potential mate fertile? All right, I just want to share a few highlights from a great book, one of the best books on evolution I've read. It's by a woman in Boston. It's called Warriors and Worriers, but her basic take is that men in many parts of their psychology are prepped to be coalitional partners in some kind of violent coalitional war, and girls are largely prepped to make sure that their offspring survive. And so the fact that women worry more is not something that's silly. It's something that is very much paid off in their evolutionary history. When they never stopped worrying about whether their kids were safe, they were much more likely to have kids survive into adulthood. So some things she points out is we call boys' play rambunctious or things like that, but raising a son, I can tell you that there is much interest in coalitional, violent kind of play and imagining different war scenes. We were listening to a tape of this book together, and I asked Tyler if that was true, and he said, so do you, even when you're not playing war, do you fantasize about war like the author's saying? And he said, oh yeah, I was just thinking about if South Korea attacked, there would be a bomb that would go off and it would kill these people, but me and these guys would be in this ditch, and so we would survive and do these things. So boys tend to think like that. With Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts have taken kids into the woods. The first thing they want to do is go into the woods, build a fort with booby traps. Girls' play is very different. It tends to be more help-oriented. There's more practicing childcare with dolls, etc. When you look at relationships, boys versus girls, you can again see the dynamics of the different reproductive challenges they face playing out. Boys are very inclined to have disagreements with other boys, but then patch things over. So Benson talks about a case where two boys get in a fight. One stabs the other one with a knife. It leads to the kid going to the hospital. But 2 weeks later, they make up. They get over it. That probably wouldn't happen with women. So boys, because of the likelihood that they'll be engaged in coalitional conflict at some point, they need allies. So they're loath to write anybody off. Girls, on the other hand, are more likely to view other women as potential competitors for mates. So women will typically have a few female allies, but women can find it harder to collaborate with other women, in part because there's this underlying potential for competition. And so you're more likely to see, for example, women going to college that have a falling out with their roommate. That can really affect their performance in college and whether or not they stay at college. Whereas boys that have a conflict with their roommate is not nearly as impactful. So girls' relationships, they can be very deep, but they can also rupture. They can have a certain breaking point. And you see some of that in relationships with girls being more tumultuous. Now, on the other hand, boys grow up to men and they start wars. So, figure which one is more dangerous. Okay, but again, bringing in the coalitional conflict, the fact that men form these coalitions in our ancestral past that would go out on these raids and get into wars with other groups, it could be that women might prefer men that were good at that because they would secure more resources. So let's see, what's something similar to coalitional conflict? Sports? Well, let's look and see. There was a study that examined whether women would be more attractive to men playing sports. And they had some neat groups here. It wasn't just, they had no sport, casual sport, non-aggressive sport, and aggressive sport. So aggressive sport being something like football. Well, you can find across a variety of relationships index, like, do you find them attractive? Would you want to date them? Would you want to have a relationship? Would you have sex with them? Long-term, marry, child? That across the board, they found the men engaged in the aggressive sports significantly more attractive. Non-aggressive sport was better, but once you were down to no sport or casual sport, you were not that, you were significantly less desirable. Okay, but then here's the interesting twist. In another study, this is going back a ways, they found that men playing aggressive high school sports were more psychologically and physically aggressive towards their partners, more likely to use sexual coercion, and more accepting of rape, myths, and violence. So in other words, it's a double-edged sword that women have to navigate the situation that the same men that might be good at coalitional conflict and can secure resources might be the same kind of guys that are exploitive or take them for granted, etc. So there's a lot of complex dynamics and pushing and pulling and tensions. So it's not surprising that men and women can sometimes be in conflict. Okay, and then last thing I just want to mention, we'll talk about more of this when we get to ideology, but Schwartz value theory posits these 10 values across all different kinds of cultures, and there's a bunch of supporting research that validates this. Adjacent values, so like self-direction and universalism, tend to be positively correlated. Ones that are on opposite sides of the circle are negatively correlated. So someone who's very interested in achievement, or I should say status, with power, is not all that inclined to support universalism. That is, caring and for nature and people that are outside of your in-group. The reason I mention this here is it's likely that from an evolutionary perspective, this is capturing trade-offs that occurred in the evolutionary environment. So one way of thinking about this is that in environments where there was more coalitional conflict, you would do better if you valued things like power and security, and you would do not as well if you valued things like self-direction and universalism. So in other words, if you were in a threatening environment where there's coalitional threats, these kind of values would be potentially more useful. Over here, these kind of values, i.e. liberal values, would be more useful if it was less threatening. So we'll talk more about this when we get to ideology, but you can imagine trade-offs. So evolutionary theory can take some existing psychology models like this and give us a better sense of why they may work the way they do. Okay, that's it. Next up in our evolutionary track, we'll dig into mating and reproductive psychology a little more in depth. Thanks for listening.